Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture that I think we've all been anticipating and hoping for. You have a very hungry audience here, Noam, looking for wisdom and I hope also some ways out. This is a part of a lecture series sponsored by begun by 4 faculty at the university, my colleagues Rashid Khalidi, Mahmoud Mamdani, Professor Eric Foner, and myself, out of a feeling that we really desperately need to have a vigorous, ongoing, systematic debate about U.S. foreign policy. And most importantly, we have to hear the critical voices now, because the critical voices have been right, and uncannily so, and because we're entering an even more dangerous period, clearly, right now. I think today's speaker certainly is the person that one would have in mind in the whole world in terms of being the leading critic and somebody who has shed more light on the issues of American foreign policy behavior than perhaps anybody else. All of you know that when you visit an English language bookstore abroad, it is a Chomsky bookstore with a few other books. And I don't know whether it's literally true that Noam Chomsky is the most widely read American author, but I'm almost sure it's true in foreign policy, and deservedly so. Of course, Professor Chomsky remade or invented or revolutionized, whatever term one wants to use, modern linguistics. And in a way, I think he has applied the linguistic tools to foreign policy to help us understand what we hear and how we think about what we hear. And it's for that reason, breathtakingly exciting to have you here, Noam, and we all look forward to your remarks.
You're hungry and we're not, as we just came from a very nice lunch at the faculty club. But the hideous crimes of the 20th century led to dedicated efforts to save humans from the curse of war. And the word save is no exaggeration. Surely, since it became clear in 1945 that the likelihood of ultimate doom is well beyond what any rational person would be willing to tolerate. Actually, the phrase ultimate doom is not mine. As a more interesting source, I'm borrowing it from 2 prominent strategic analysts writing in the current issue of maybe the most sober and respectable journal in the world, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, not given to hyperbole. They conclude that Washington's current military programs and aggressive stance, which have their origins in the Clinton years but have been accelerated very sharply in the last few, they say these carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, and they go on to express the hope that the threat will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving nations led by China. Okay, we've come to a pretty pass when such thoughts are expressed right at the heart of the establishment, and what that implies about the state of American democracy, where the issues don't even enter the electoral arena or the arena of public discussion, that's no less shocking. And as for what we can do, it's to overcome that huge democratic deficit. which may indeed lead to ultimate doom. Shouldn't be waiting for China to do something about it. It's also not comforting to read a related article in the same issue in which a leading authority on constitutional law discusses the concept of sovereignty that has been crafted by the Justice Department, articulating, as he puts it, a view of presidential authority that is all too close to the powers that Carl Schmitt, the leading German philosopher of law during the Nazi period, was willing to accord to his own Führer. And to add a bit more, the legal authority who transmitted Schmitt's view of presidential authority to the president also advised Bush to rescind the Geneva Conventions, the supreme law of the land and the core of modern humanitarian law. And he did so for quite sound reasons. He explained that if the Geneva Conventions remain in force, the president and his associates might be found guilty under the War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by the Republican Congress, which carries the death penalty. He's just been appointed Attorney General and is being described as a moderate. The efforts to end the curse of war led to a consensus on the principles that should guide state action. It was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Formally, the consensus remains, but it's quite interesting to see how the spectrum has shifted within intellectual opinion. It's shifted so much that the post-war consensus has drifted to the extremist end of public discussion and electoral politics. In fact, it's off the spectrum of electoral politics. I'll return to the post-war consensus and its fate and the current implications, but first we should take a moment to remember the virtual disappearance of it, which is quite recent. Just in the last years of the last millennium and the early years of this millennium, these were a remarkable moment of intellectual history. I'm not sure there's anything quite like them in the none-too-glorious history of intellectuals. Across the spectrum of articulate opinion in those few years, there was enthusiastic celebration, these are all quotes, of a normative revolution in world affairs, with awed acclaim for the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which had entered a noble phase in its foreign policy with a saintly glow. For the first time in history, a state is dedicated to principles and values, acting from altruism and moral fervor alone as the leader of the enlightened states, hence free to resort to force to determine for what its leaders determine to be right. So post-war consensus is off the agenda. That's a very small sample of an extraordinary deluge. I've selected only from the most respected liberal voices, kind of like off at the critical end of the spectrum. After several years of such rhetorical flights, a few events were brought forth as evidence for this impressive exercise of self-adulation, primarily the bombing of Serbia. It was regarded to that action that the phrase illegal but legitimate was coined in an unusually careful and sober evaluation of the bombing. Very unusual. I'll return to it. Well, in this atmosphere of self-adulation, highly regarded legal scholars explained that the framework of international law that had been established after World War II was just, quoting now, hot air. The grand attempt to subject the rule of force to the rule of law should be deposited in the ash can of history. The conclusive proof came a few years later, the same legal authority writes, and he's again on the liberal extreme, it became a few years later when Washington made it clear that it intends to do all it can to maintain its preeminence, that it would ignore the UN Security Council, over Iraq and would no longer be bound by the United Nations Charter, the rules governing the use of force. Therefore, the rules have collapsed, and in the winter of 2003, the entire edifice came crashing down, which is a good thing, he concludes, because the leader of the enlightened states, his term, must resist any effort to curb its use of force. Okay, again, I'm quoting from the liberal end of very distinguished international legal opinion in the leading establishment journals and a highly praised book. Well, these declarations do encapsulate with clarity and honesty what has become, in practice, a prevailing elite consensus. And it should be stressed, however, that these are not the views of the general public. Those we know, they don't get reported, but we know them from very careful studies of the best public opinion studies organizations, many of them last October, released before the election. Turns out that a considerable majority of the population believe that the United States should accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court, should sign the Kyoto Protocols, should rely on the United Nations to take the lead in international crises, including the specific case of Iraq, including security, reconstruction, political transition in Iraq, and the United States should even abandon the Security Council veto. It should rely on diplomatic and economic measures more than military ones in the so-called war on terror, and it should use force only if, I'm quoting, there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked, thus rejecting the bipartisan consensus on what's misleadingly called preemptive war. It's notable that it goes on like this. These views are held by people in virtual isolation. They very rarely hear them. Probably the people who give those answers assume I'm the only one in the country who thinks this. I have no other basis for it. None of this is discussed publicly in the media, the journals, except way at the extreme. Doesn't enter political campaigns, and only very marginally in opinion journals and media. And the same extends to other domains. I won't go into it, but it does raise very important questions in our own country about what we call a democratic deficit when we talk about others, meaning formal institutions but not functioning. The efforts to spare the world the horrors of war received their formal expression first in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which sought to outlaw war, but they took a definitive form in the United Nations Charter, which opens by expressing the determination of the signatories, I'm quoting it, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetimes has brought untold sorrow to mankind. And by then, not just untold sorrow, but total destruction, as all participants knew, but also knew they could not mention. So the words atomic and nuclear do not appear in the Charter. In the United States, the Charter is part of the supreme law of the land. Its provisions were spelled out further in the Nuremberg Tribunal judgments, which declares that initiation of a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. So, for example, it's in a way a mistake to talk about the extreme and overt war crimes that are being carried out in Fallujah, because they are simply part of the evil of the whole once you carry out aggression, then particular war crimes like attacking hospitals and so on don't really count. At Nuremberg, those who were judged to have played any role in the supreme crime, for example, the German foreign minister, were sentenced to death by hanging. The Tokyo tribunal was far more severe. Well, although the principles they enunciated were significant, both tribunals, Nuremberg and Tokyo, were deeply flawed by the most elementary moral standards. Their founding principles very explicitly rejected the principle of universality, the foundation of all moral judgment, which says that we apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others if we're serious, more stringent ones. That was all rejected very explicitly. They had to define war crime and crime against humanity, and it was crafted explicitly in such a way as to exclude the victors. It was not concealed. It was discussed openly that if the victors had carried out a crime, it wasn't a war crime. So the actual definition of war crime and crime against humanity for the tribunals was crime that you carried out and we did not. And to underscore that fact in the actual tribunal proceedings, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. counterparts had carried out the same crimes. Well, every subsequent tribunal is discredited by the same moral flaw. Take one that's going on right now, the Yugoslavia tribunal, now in session in The Hague. It's a striking example. A group of international lawyers requested the tribunal to investigate NATO crimes that were recorded by the major human rights organizations and other sources, in fact, even admitted by the NATO command. The prosecution rejected the request without investigation, which happens to be violation of the laws of the statutes of the tribunal. The first prosecutor, Louise Arbour, stated right in the midst of the bombing that I accept the assurances given by NATO leaders that they intend to comply with international humanitarian law. So no investigation is necessary. Her successor, Carla Del Ponte, simply stated that NATO assurances left her very satisfied that there is no basis for opening an investigation of the NATO air campaign. Okay, finishes that. That's actually consistent with the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunal judgments. The powerful are immune by definition. Doesn't matter what the facts are, so there's no need for an investigation. Yugoslavia did bring charges to the World Court. That's also ongoing. It invoked, among other things, the Genocide Convention. And these proceedings do continue, but without the participation of the United States excluded itself on the grounds that when Washington finally signed the Genocide Convention after 40 years, it added a reservation excluding itself from charges. And the court correctly accepted that argument. World Court statutes require that both sides agree to be subject to adjudication. Well, much the same happened in the case that was brought by Nicaragua against the United States 20 years ago. A core part of Nicaragua's case, which was actually presented by a distinguished Harvard University law professor, a large part of the case was rejected by the court on the grounds that when the United States accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, it had entered a reservation excluding itself from prosecution under any multilateral treaty, hence excluding the supreme crime of aggression. The court was therefore compelled to restrict its deliberations to what's called customary international law and a single bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaty. But even on these very narrow grounds, the court charged Washington with unlawful use of force. That's a technical term that in lay language means international terrorism, and ordered the United States to terminate the crimes and pay substantial reparations, which would go far beyond paying off the huge debt that is now strangling Nicaragua. So there are indeed some very conservative ways to get rid of third world debt, like following court orders. The elite consensus dismissed the court as a hostile forum, a phrase used by the New York Times editors, reflecting the prevailing view. The U.S. reacted by escalating the war against Nicaragua and vetoing 2 Security Council resolutions that affirmed the court judgment. The targeted country was virtually destroyed, sank further into misery after the U.S. took it over again in 1990. By now, 60% of children under 2 suffer severe malnutrition, probable brain damage. That's a radical change from 20 years ago, when Washington was panicked by reports from UNICEF, the World Bank, and other international agencies about what they called, I'm quoting them, Nicaragua's remarkable achievements that were laying a solid foundation for long-term socioeconomic development, as the country enjoyed one of the most dramatic improvements in child survival in the developing world. No fear of that anymore. None of this was deemed worthy of attention as the wave of self-adulation crested and the perpetrators of the crime returned to office. Well, in the case of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the U.S. actually took no chances. Washington insisted that the tribunal exclude crimes against peace, that is, the most serious crimes, aggression. That's the supreme crime of Nuremberg. The U.S. insisted that the tribunal not be allowed to consider that. The reason was explained by the American drafter. He said that the U.S. did not want to establish precedents that might hamper U.S. military action, such as the invasion of Panama, which had just taken place and which had been condemned by the UN General Assembly, but not the Security Council, thanks to the veto, which prevents that. Rejection of the principle of universality is understandable. All you have to do is think through the consequences if we were willing to entertain elementary moral standards. So if, say, the United States is entitled to carry out what's now called anticipatory self-defense against terror in accord with the elite consensus, there's no disagreement about this. If it's entitled to, except for the public, but according to the elite consensus, we have that right. Then it follows at once that Cuba, Nicaragua, and a host of others have long been entitled to carry out terrorist acts within the United States, because there's no doubt whatsoever of U.S. involvement in very serious terrorist attacks against them, extensively documented in impeccable sources. In the case of Nicaragua, even condemned by the World Court and the Security Council in vetoed resolutions. The conclusion, of course, is utterly outrageous, and nobody advocates that. And in fact, there are still more outrageous conclusions if we're willing to think. So, for example, no one would agree that would argue that Japan exercised the right of anticipatory self-defense when it bombed U.S. military bases in the U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines, even though the Japanese knew very well that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing assembly lines, and they were surely familiar with the very public discussion in the U.S. press explaining how these planes could be used to incinerate Japan's wooden cities in a war of extermination, taking off from their Hawaiian and Philippine bases. Notice that Japan had far better arguments for bombing Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, U.S. colonies, military bases, than Blair or Bush ever concocted in the case of Iraq. But no one says we should therefore go out and celebrate Pearl Harbor Day every year because of the nobility of Japan's foreign policy. The reason is the usual one. The powerful are exempt from moral principles, uniquely, because they so declare. Nor would anyone accord the right of anticipatory self-defense to any other state today, apart from the self-declared enlightened states, which have the power to determine norms, and they apply them selectively at will, while basking in self-praise. These are among the prerogatives of power in well-disciplined societies. The principle of universality has a crucial exception, and rejection of moral norms, moral truisms, the most elementary of them, is so deeply entrenched that even raising the question would be considered an unspeakable abomination. These happen to be our fundamental guiding values, worth thinking about. Well, let's return to the resort to force. The UN Charter is quite explicit about what's permitted, namely when it's authorized by the Security Council or is undertaken in self-defense against armed attack until the Security Council acts. That concept is spelled out in the famous wording of Daniel Webster, quoted, that response to armed attack is legitimate when the necessity for action is instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, no moment of deliberation. Response under these conditions is preemptive war. Any other resort to force is the supreme international crime, which encompasses all subsequent evil. Domestic and international law are not formal axiom systems, and there's some scope for interpretation. But as far as human affairs are concerned, the meaning and implications are very clear. At the very least, they set a standard by which any resort to force should be evaluated. That should be conventional understanding, I think. It is not, however. It's off the spectrum, apart from the general population, which accepts this stand, as I mentioned. A sharp split in the population here between the general population and educated elites. That's actually been true for a long time. There's plenty of documentation for it, which I won't review. In brief, the idea that the U.S. should adhere to international law and its own constitution, unless very powerful justification can be given from departure for those principles, that's now an extremist position in elite discourse. So extreme that it's scarcely even mentioned in very crucial and obvious cases. Now, these, I think, are matters that should concern us, quite apart from their non-trivial connection to the likelihood of ultimate doom. The conventional position is that the U.S. has the unilateral right to resort to force when it chooses to do so. It's the position of the Bush administration, formulated in its national security strategy, but expressed clearly enough before 9/11. So in an article in Foreign Affairs, even before the election, Condoleezza Rice, now the new Secretary of State as of this morning, she condemned what she called the reflexive appeal to notions of international law and norms, and the belief that the support of many states, or even better, of institutions like the United Nations, is essential to the legitimate exercise of power. So she condemns that. By the United States, of course, the usual exception prevails, doesn't work for others. This extremist position is, in fact, conventional. She wasn't breaking any new ground. So I'll just keep to the left liberal extreme for a few illustrations. Elder statesman and Kennedy advisor Dean Acheson informed the American Society of International Law in 1963 that, in his words, no legal issue arises when the U.S. responds to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige. we don't even need any pretexts, in other words. He was speaking shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had brought the world close to the brink of nuclear war a few months earlier. An important part of the background for that, which he of course knew, was Kennedy's campaign to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. The phrase is historian and Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger, in his biography of Robert Kennedy, who was assigned responsibility for the massive international terrorist attack, which escalated in later years, actually continuing into the late 1990s. Well, that's Kennedy and Atchison. Clinton adopted essentially the same position. There was a Clinton doctrine. It advocated, I'll quote it, unilateral use of military power to defend vital interests, such as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, without even the pretexts that Bush and Blair devised. Well, taken literally, the Clinton doctrine is far more expansive than the Bush national security strategy, which declared the right to use force to dominate the world and destroy any potential challenge. The Bush national security strategy aroused enormous fear and concern around the world and elicited very harsh criticism, even within the foreign policy establishment. The more expansive Clinton doctrine, in contrast, was barely even reported. And the extensive literature on the national security strategy makes the difference clear. The objections had to do with style and manner of presentation, not substance. There's no disagreement on that. It was put rather well by Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in an article in Foreign Affairs. She pointed out that every president has such a doctrine in his back pocket, but it's simply foolish to smash people in the face with it and to implement it in a manner which is going to antagonize and infuriate even allies. So keep the doctrine, it's fine, but kind of be sensible about it. That's the political spectrum that we have. Well, continuing with the current consensus, the positions expressed by Atchison, the Reagan State Department, Clinton, the current administration, they also receive an instructive expression in the scholarly literature. That's a matter that's worth looking at carefully, particularly in an academic setting. So I hope you don't mind if I take a little excursion into this. There actually is one book so far, one leading historian, John Lewis Gaddis of Yale, who has just published a book that supports Bush administration programs with the usual provisos about error in tactics. The book was so popular in the White House, the New York Times reported, that Gaddis was invited over for a discussion. Gaddis is a very good historian, kind of on the liberal side. He differs from others within the mainstream in that he goes into the relevant historical background. Crucially with regard to what's called preemptive war. He traces the doctrine to one of his intellectual heroes, the great grand strategist John Quincy Adams. In the accurate New York Times paraphrase, Gaddis suggests that Bush's framework for fighting terrorism has its roots in the lofty idealistic tradition of John Quincy Adams and Woodrow Wilson. I'll return to a couple of words about Wilson's idealism, but much more important is Adams, who established the lofty idealistic tradition in a very famous state paper justifying Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida in the First Seminole War of 1818. Adams argued that the war was justified in self-defense. Gaddis agrees that its motives were legitimate security concerns. In Gaddis's version, after the British sacked Washington in 1814, U.S. leaders recognized that expansion is the path to security and therefore conquered Florida, a doctrine now expanded to the whole world by Bush, properly, he argues. So that's the story. And he, in fact, cites the right scholarly sources Gaddis, good historian, primarily historian William Earl Weeks, who did the most careful analysis. But he omits what they say. And actually we learn a lot about the precedents for current doctrines and the current consensus by filling in the gaps. So let's look at that. What does Weeks actually say? What follows is mostly quotes from his main source. Weeks describes in lurid detail what Jackson was doing in the exhibition of murder and plunder known as the First Seminole War, which was just another phase in his project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast, which was underway long before 1814. That had nothing to do with it. Florida was a problem, both because it had not yet been incorporated into the expanding American empire, as it was frankly called by the founding fathers, and because it was, quoting, a haven for Indians and runaway slaves fleeing the wrath of Jackson or slavery. There was, in fact, an Indian attack, which Jackson and Adams used as a pretext for the self-defense argument. U.S. forces drove a band of Seminoles off their lands, killing several of them and burning their village to the ground. They retaliated by attacking a supply boat under military command, and seizing the opportunity, Jackson, quoting again, embarked on a campaign of terror, devastation, and intimidation, destroying villages and sources of food in a calculated attempt to inflict starvation on the tribes who sought refuge from his wrath in the swamps. And so matters continued, leading to Adams' highly regarded state paper, which endorsed Jackson's unprovoked aggression to establish in Florida the dominion of this republic upon the odious basis of violence and bloodshed. Those happen to be the words of the Spanish ambassador, but as Weeks writes, a painfully precise description. Weeks continues, Adams had consciously distorted, dissembled, and lied about the goals and conduct of American foreign policy to both Congress and the public. If that sounds familiar, it's not an accident. He had grossly violated his proclaimed moral principles, implicitly defending Indian removal and slavery. The crimes of Jackson and Adams proved but a prelude to a second war of extermination against the Seminoles, in which the remnants either fled to the west to enjoy the same fate later, or were killed or forced to take refuge in the dense swamps of Florida. Today, Weeks concludes, the Seminoles survive in the national consciousness as the mascot of Florida State University, which is again a very typical case. Weeks also stresses the important point that Adams, his forceful endorsement of Jackson's crimes, shifted the power to make war from Congress, which is what the Constitution says, to the executive in violation of the Constitution. It's a principle that remains in force since 1818, not troubling strict constructionists, apparently. He goes on to point out that Adams's rhetoric also established, I'm quoting, the presidential rhetoric of empire designed to marshal public and congressional support for its policies, a durable and essential aspect of American diplomacy, inherited and elaborated by successive generations of American statesmen, but fundamentally unchanged over time. The rhetorical framework, he says, rests on three pillars: the assumption of the unique moral virtue of the United States, the assertion of its mission to reform the world, to redeem the world by spreading its professed ideals and the American way of life, and the faith in the nation's preordained destiny. The theological framework undercuts reasoned debate, and it reduces policy to a choice between good and evil, therefore reducing the ever-present threat of democracy. Critics can be dismissed as anti-American, an interesting concept borrowed from the lexicon of totalitarianism. The issue of defense against Britain, the only potential enemy, never even arose remotely. The British Minister Castlereagh, was so eager to cement Anglo-American relations that he even overlooked Jackson's murder of 2 innocent British citizens, which Adams defended for, as he put it, for its salutary efficacy for terror and example. Weeks suggests that Adams was heeding the words of Tacitus, his favorite historian, that crime once exposed had no refuge but in audacity. The goal of Adams's diplomacy had nothing to do with security. It was territorial expansion to the Pacific. And that was finally achieved, although in one sense the British threat was not overcome. British military force barred the intended conquest of Canada and Cuba. As for Cuba, Adams predicted that it would drop into U.S. hands like a ripe fruit by the laws of political gravitation once the U.S. had succeeded in overcoming its British enemy. And by the end of the century, the laws of political gravitation were working, and the U.S. was able to intervene to bar Cuba's liberation from Spain. That's what we call liberating Cuba, but in fact it was preventing the liberation of Cuba and turning Cuba into a virtual colony of the United States, quoting 2 respected Harvard historians, quite conservative, until 1959, when we had to turn to international terrorism and illegal embargo to restore this story. Well, filling in the blanks, the actual picture does support Gaddis's judgments about the precedents for the Bush Doctrine and its implementation. As for the expansion of the doctrine to the entire world, others may judge for themselves, and the world has judged. As international polls have shown, fear and often hatred of the United States has risen to unprecedented heights, significantly increasing the threat of terror and also the likelihood of ultimate doom. Well, to summarize briefly, there is a spectrum of opinion on the resort to military force. At one extreme, so remote from received opinion that it's scarcely even mentioned, is the post-war consensus formally articulated in the UN Charter, the Nuremberg Tribunal, and subsequent extensions of these principles. The rest of the spectrum, meaning about 100% of it, basically adopts the principle that the United States is uniquely exempt from international law and is entitled to resort to any measures it chooses to respond to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige, and to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Just quoting again from the left liberal end of the consensus. The more honest are explicit in declaring these rights to be restricted to the U.S. and its clients, not to be universalized. But I have to stress again that the American public is off the spectrum. It seems to keep firmly to the post-war consensus, which is virtually excluded, totally excluded, in fact, from the political system, and virtually excluded from articulate opinion, except at the margins. Now, at the margins, we do find more nuanced opinions on the resort to force. One of the most important is the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Kosovo War. It was headed by the distinguished South African jurist, Justice Richard Goldstone. The commission rendered the harshest criticism of the NATO bombing anywhere near the mainstream, concluding that the bombing was illegal but legitimate. That's the phrase they used. They said it was illegal because it did not receive approval from the UN Security Council, but it was legitimate because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted and there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo. Justice Goldstone concluded from this that the UN Charter may need revision in the light of the report of his commission and the judgments on which it's based. The NATO intervention, he explains, is too important a precedent for it to be regarded as an aberration. Rather, state sovereignty is being redefined in the face of globalization and by the resolve of the majority of the peoples of the world that human rights have become the business of the international community. And he also stressed the need for objective analysis of human rights abuses. Actually, that last comment is good advice, so let's follow it. One question that an objective analysis might address is whether indeed the majority of the world's peoples accept the judgment of the enlightened states. Well, you can review the world press and official statements, and you find that that's totally false. In fact, the bombing of Serbia was bitterly condemned outside the NATO countries, very little of it reported here. Furthermore, it's hardly likely that the self-exemption of the enlightened states from the UN Charter and the Nuremberg Principles would gain the approval of much of the world's population. Well, another question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed, to quote Goldstone, all diplomatic options had been exhausted in Kosovo. It's easy to check. When NATO decided to bomb, there were two diplomatic options on the table. There was a NATO proposal and a Serbian proposal. The latter kept from the public here, but it's a public document. After 78 days of bombing, a compromise was reached between them. Okay? That indicates that diplomatic options were indeed available. A third question is, quoting again, whether there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, as the Commission asserted, obviously a crucial matter. Well, here objective analysis happens to be unusually easy. There is a vast documentary record available from impeccable Western sources that includes several compilations, big compilations put together by the State Department, released in justification for the war, the detailed records of the OSCE, of NATO, the United Nations, a lengthy and detailed British parliamentary inquiry, and other similar sources. They all reach the same conclusion. The killings and atrocities followed the bombing, as the Milosevic indictment itself indicates. Take a look at it. It's for crimes committed after the bombing, with a marginal exception. And as the NATO command had announced at once, and later confirmed in more detail, it was anticipated that the bombing would elicit the crimes that followed. How is this handled? Well, there's huge literature on Kosovo. After all, that was the proof of the normative revolution. It handles it very easily. It ignores the enormous documentary record entirely. Try to find a reference to it. And it's impeccable Western documentation. Couldn't get anything more reliable. And almost invariably, the literature reverses the chronology so that the bombing can be justified in response to the atrocities it elicited and is expected to elicit. Actually, I've reviewed this rather instructive record in some detail in print, and I'll skip it here. But check. Can learn a lot about ourselves. Kosovo was not a pretty place before the NATO bombing. According to Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed on all sides in the year prior to the invasion, and many of them by KLA guerrillas, Albanian guerrillas, attacking Serbs from Albania in an effort, as they quite openly announced, to elicit a harsh reaction that could rally Western opinion to their cause. The British government, which was the most hawkish element in the alliance, they make the astonishing claim that until January 1999, most of the 2,000 were killed by the KLA. And Western sources consistently report that there was no significant change after January 1999 until March of that year when the bombing started. So they are basically saying that most of the killings were by then CIA-backed guerrillas attacking from Albania. That's the most hawkish element in the alliance. One of the very few scholarly studies even to consider these matters estimates that Serbs were responsible for 500 of the 2,000 killed. That's a careful and judicious study by Nicholas Wheeler, who supports the NATO bombing on the grounds that there would have been worse atrocities if NATO had not bombed. So the argument is that by bombing with the anticipation that it will lead to atrocities, NATO was preventing atrocities. That such arguments are taken seriously gives no slight insight into Western intellectual culture, particularly when we recall that there were diplomatic options and that the agreement reached after 78 days of bombing was a compromise between them, formally at least. NATO instantly got rid of the treaty that it signed and imposed its own interpretation. There's no time to review the history. Well, Kosovo was actually one of the two achievements that was brought forth to give retrospective proof that for the first time in history, states were observing principles and values, all the rest. The second example used was East Timor. That example is far more atrocious. I mean, the fact that it can even be brought up without shame is an amazing comment on Western intellectual culture. And here, almost the entire West is complicit, though the U.S.-British role was the worst. Okay, that too was extensively discussed in print, so I'll skip it and end with what is commonly given as the paradigm example of selfless humanitarian intervention and is, unhappily, again in the news right now, namely Haiti. Well, there's no time to review the history, which is quite horrifying. The two most guilty parties are France and the United States. The U.S. role took an even uglier turn under Wilsonian idealism. Wilson's Marines invaded in 1915. They killed thousands of people, reinstituted virtual slavery, turned Haiti into an American plantation by a very simple device. The Parliament was disbanded by genuine Marine Corps measures, as the commander reported. It was disbanded because it refused to accept what was called a progressive measure necessary to ensure Haiti's economic development, namely a law allowing U.S. corporations to take over the country by means quite similar to those illegally instituted by Viceroy Bremer in Iraq in the last year. Wilson's Marines then ran a free referendum, because we really believe in free elections. In the referendum, 5% of the population participated, and 99% voted in favor of the required law, for which Franklin Delano Roosevelt later took credit, rightly or not. After 19 years, the Marine occupation ended, having devastated much of the country. It left the country in the hands of the vicious National Guard that Wilson established. I'll skip the rest of the hideous story, up to 1990, when a really horrifying event took place. The country had a genuinely free election, its first. The election was won by a populist priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, while Washington's candidate, a former World Bank official, received 14% of the vote. Nobody expected that. Nobody had been paying any attention to what was going on in the slums and the hills of Haiti, where a genuine democratic culture developed in the poorest country in the hemisphere, and was able to have a democratic election of a kind that is unimaginable here. They elected their own candidate. Washington was appalled, of course, and moved at once to undermine the democratic government. When it was overthrown by a military coup a few months later, Bush #1 and then Clinton effectively supported the military junta and its wealthy supporters. They even authorized the Texaco Oil Company to supply them with oil in violation of presidential directives, thus rendering the OAS blockade that the U.S. had been openly undermining almost entirely meaningless. After 3 years of state violence, Clinton decided that the population had suffered enough torture and murder, and he allowed President Aristide to return, but on a crucial condition, namely that he had to adopt the program of the defeated U.S. candidate in the 1990 elections. Okay, that's what we call restoring democracy in an altruistic effort at nation building. As was predicted at once, the harsh programs imposed on Haiti undermined what was left of economic sovereignty and drove the country into chaos and violence, which was accelerated by Bush II, who, when he banned international aid on completely cynical grounds. Last February, the army and the murderous junta were placed back in power with the help of France and the United States, the two most guilty parties. And now there's a new reign of terror. That's now. We read in the British press that the most publicized case is that of Gérard Jean-Just, a Catholic priest who was arrested last month at a soup kitchen that he runs for children. He's in jail without charge. He struck a note with me. I happened to meet him in 1993 when I was in Haiti at the height of the terror. He was then underground. I've been in many awful places in the world, but I have never seen anything like the terror in the slums of Port-au-Prince under the guns of the junta, and rarely anything like the misery and poverty. The junta is now back in power, thanks primarily to the nobility of our foreign policy with its saintly glow. The paradigm example of humanitarian intervention is not so simple if we take the trouble to look at the facts, always a useful exercise. Few questions are more important today than the propriety of the use of force. And no doubt one can imagine, and maybe even find, genuine cases of humanitarian intervention, but there's always a heavy burden of proof, and the historical record should give us pause, not only our own, but that of others. We might recall, for example, the observations of maybe the major scholarly study of humanitarian intervention in legal scholarship. It finds three examples of humanitarian intervention between the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 and the UN Charter. The three are Japan's invasion of Manchuria and North China, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, and Hitler's takeover of the Sudetenland. Now, it's not, of course, that the author regards these as genuine examples. Rather, they're the only potential ones. And, of course, they were depicted as humanitarian intervention, and evidence was indeed provided, and however grotesque it was regarded with some sympathy in the United States and Britain. In fact, the use of force is almost always accompanied by professions of benign intent, near universal, predictable, therefore totally uninformative. Inquiry might also unearth genuine cases of intervention that is illegal but legitimate, although the prime example offered leaves this as a dubious doctrine for the times, and it tends to reinforce the measured judgment of the World Court in 1949, which was reaffirmed in the Nicaragua case and others that I'll quote the court. The court can only regard the alleged right of intervention as the manifestation of a policy of force, such as has in the past given rise to most serious abuses, and such as cannot, whatever be the defects in international organization, find a place in international law. From the nature of things, intervention would be reserved for the most powerful states and might easily lead to the perverting of the administration of justice itself. Now, those are words worth pondering, I think.
Thank you for those powerful words indeed. We have 10 minutes for questions. We have microphones set up. Please, given the limited amount of time Professor Chomsky has to get to the airport, be brief and do ask a question. And please identify yourself first.
Bob Thompson, alum. Why do you think that these lawyers' torture memos on the enemy combatants, which violate international law and constitutional law, are now the elite consensus of intellects and academia? And also, could you describe a little bit more the development of the cause, why they even wrote these things, if they violated human rights and justice and international law?
Well, actually, to be precise, that's not a consensus. So Gonzalez's torture memos, it came under plenty of criticism. Can you hear me? Gonzalez's torture memos came under a lot of criticism. So the idea that we have the right to commit torture and dismantle the Geneva Conventions was not an elite consensus. There was plenty of criticism of that. On that issue, there was debate. How did this come about? Well, you know the history. We're not the only country that does it. There are other countries where torture is legitimate. There's one country, our closest ally, which I believe is the only country in the world right now, at least the only Western country, in which evidence obtained under torture can be used for conviction even without supporting evidence. Okay, so torture is technically illegal, but if you get a confession under torture, it can still be used even without supporting evidence. That's Israel, where for years torture was legal. And of course it goes on all over the place. In fact, it goes on in our own prisons. But to take a stand as strong as the one that the Justice Department transmitted to Bush, that did raise objections, like the ones I quoted, in fact, which compared it to the Nazis. It's not an usual comparison at the heart of the establishment.
Could you think of or imagine any form or shape in which you might support American military action, which was taken in anticipation of, like the President's justification, in anticipation of an imminent and dangerous threat to the United States? Not that the President, I'm justifying the President, but can you conceive of any form in which you might support such action?
Well, why don't you generalize it and say, can you conceive of any action which any state might take? Yeah. Yeah, sure, you can imagine such things. I mean, suppose, let's say you're in Iran right now. Okay. Iran is, that's a real problem. Iran is surrounded, first of all, it's under attack by the world superpower with embargoes, this, that, and the other thing. It's surrounded by states either occupied by its superpower enemy or having nuclear weapons. A little way down the road is the regional superpower, which has hundreds of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction and is essentially an offshore U.S. military base and has the biggest air force and technologically most advanced air force in NATO, more than any NATO power outside the United States, and in the past year has been supplied by the global superpower with 100 advanced jet bombers, openly advertised as able to fly to Iran and back to bomb it, and also provided with I'm talking about Israel, provided with what the Hebrew press calls special weaponry. Well, nobody knows what that means, but if you're an Iranian intelligence analyst, you're going to give a worst-case analysis of it, of course, and has actually been publicly provided with smart bombs and deep penetration weapons and so on. I mean, they have a terrific justification for anticipatory self-defense, better than any other case I can think of, but do I approve of it? Like, would I approve of their bombing Israel or carrying out terrorist acts in Washington and so on? No. Even though they have a pretty strong case, better than anything I can think of here. Just as the Japanese had a much better case than any that I can think of here, but I don't approve of Pearl Harbor. So yeah, we can conceive of cases, and in fact some of them are right in front of our eyes, but none of us approve of them. None of us. So if we don't approve of them in real cases, which are right in front of our eyes, why discuss hypothetical cases that don't exist? I mean, we could do that in some philosophy seminar somewhere. But in the real world, there are real cases that ought to concern us, not hypothetical ones that somebody can invent. And in fact, the threat of terror and weapons of mass destruction is very severe, very severe. And the Bush administration, like the Clinton administration, doesn't care about it. In fact, they are acting consciously in ways to increase the threat. Okay, so yes, it's a serious threat. We should be concerned about it. In fact, the article I quoted on the threat of ultimate doom is talking precisely about that. It's saying, yeah, we can carry out actions in a way which increase the threat of ultimate doom for ourselves and increase the threat of terror to ourselves, but we shouldn't. They say we shouldn't do it, and we should pray that China will stop us. I think we should pray that we'll stop us. And that happens all the time. I mean, like, take, say, the invasion of Iraq. There's a big debate in Washington, which is totally pointless, and in the media about whether Bush downgraded terror in order to invade Iraq. There's nothing to debate. He invaded Iraq, okay? That proves, beyond doubt, that he downgraded the threat of terror in favor of invading Iraq. They anticipated, and their own intelligence agencies told them, and everyone else did too, that invasion of Iraq was likely to increase the threat of terror. Okay. It's not a high priority. So they invaded Iraq because that's a much higher priority. So yeah, increasing the threat of terror is not a joke. You know, you could get a nuclear weapon smuggled into a New York hotel room, and sooner or later it'll happen. And if we insist on increasing the threat of terror and increasing the threat of ultimate doom, we're likely to get it. But we don't have to think about these abstract cases. We can think about real ones.
Well, I noted that
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Anna. Sorry. You noted that Clinton wanted to see unilateral military action in defense of U.S. access to markets, and I'll have to point out that this is exactly what the system of imperialism is. So therefore, how can you support simply regulating the system of imperialism? For example, I know you supported sanctions against Iraq in 1991, which led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. As well, you also supported a vote to...
This is Spartacus League?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we all know that line. It's false. It's already false, and the rest of the line, which most of us are familiar with, are false. I was always opposed to the sanctions.
It's actually not false. It's the question of what's the way forward for the world's workers and oppressed, whether you want to continue on your...
If anybody wants the Spartacus League manifesto, pick it up at the door. Yeah.
Whether you actually want to see workers take power in their own name, whether you want to see the freedom of political prisoners...
I'd love to see workers take power, but the place to organize workers is not here. If you want, I'll pay you your car fare to the nearest manufacturing plant, and you can go over and organize workers to take power. The rest of this is a waste of time. Yeah, okay. Right.
Thank you.
Fine, so go do it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student at Barnard. Wondering, what are your thoughts on how free peaceful people can protect themselves against the threat of radical Islamic terrorism here and against civilians in their own countries?
I think there's a significant specialist literature on terrorism in the United States, Israeli intelligence, a lot of others. They all come to the same conclusion. The kind of terrorism we allow ourselves to talk about, that is what somebody else does to us, not what we do to them, that kind of terrorism is a threat. It's double-edged. I mean, the terrorists themselves, they regard themselves as a vanguard who are trying to mobilize others. And the others are, a potential reservoir of sympathy on people who may hate them and fear them, but recognize that there's some justice to their claims. That's standard, whether it's the IRA in Northern Ireland or, Osama bin Laden in the Middle East or anything else. we have two ways. We ought to therefore have a double-edged response. With response to terrorists themselves, terrorist acts, those are criminal acts. They should be treated like criminal acts. That's police action. And that's worked. In fact, it's had successes in Europe, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, using Pakistan and other places, ordinary police measures to find criminals. That works. But the much more important question is, what about the people they're trying to mobilize? Well, there we have a choice. We can help the terrorists mobilize the vanguard by carrying out acts of violence, which will justify their message, or we can deal with the legitimate grievances of the people who they're trying to appeal to, which we ought to do independently of terrorism. Well, those are the answers to terrorism. You want to read about them? You can read about them in any of the specialist literature or the statements of Israeli intelligence or anybody who even thinks about the matter. But we don't want to do that. I mean the guys who run the place. They don't want to deal with the legitimate grievances because their own interests overwhelm them. And they don't care that much about the threat of terror, so they do things that exacerbate it. But we can change those policies. So I think there's a pretty clear understanding about how to deal with the category of terrorism that we allow ourselves to look at, the category in which we're the victims. And it works. So take, say, Northern Ireland. For a long time, the British responded to IRA terror, which was pretty serious, by just more violence. That's a gift to the IRA. They just organized the reservoir of sympathy and support for more terror. Actually, IRA terror was being supported from here, and like churches in Boston were supporting it. The FBI knew all about it, but they said they couldn't do anything about it. Only Saudi Arabia is supposed to stop funding terrorists. But finally, the British finally got the idea that they better look at the grievances. And they started attending to the grievances that lay beyond, that kind of were in the reservoir of potential sympathy, and it worked. I mean, it didn't work perfectly, like, Belfast isn't utopia, but it's a lot better than it was 10 years ago. That's the way to deal with terrorism if you're interested in dealing with terrorism. If you're not interested in dealing with it, like U.S. policy, you just carry out actions which extend and increase it.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Seth Barber. I'm Dr. Chomsky. This question is very broad, but it's on many people's minds. So I'll leave it to you to limit, as you choose the scope of its application. How do you interpret the Bush electoral victory, including the possibility of electoral fraud, and what do you think its implications and ramifications might be?
Okay. I have to tell you, a couple of months ago picked up a declassified CIA document, which is kind of intriguing. It's about the Kennedy assassination. It's from a couple of years ago. And it suggests to the government that they ought to occasionally leak information about the Kennedy assassination to the public, so they'll keep the Kennedy assassination industry going. People will continue to follow up leads and put together complicated stories, and that'll keep people away from asking the serious questions. Well, I don't know if the CIA actually does that, but it's a smart idea. And I don't know whether they're pushing the stories about electoral flaws or not, but if they're not doing their job. There are problems with the election, plenty, deep ones, but they have nothing to do with whether they counted the votes wrong in Ohio. I mean, just have a look at the elections. Okay, each candidate got the usual 30% of the vote. The Bush guys got a little more. The Kerry guys got a little less. It tells us absolutely nothing about the country. If the votes had shifted a little and Kerry had gotten a little more and Bush left, you'd have a different guy in the White House. It would still tell you nothing about the country. And the reasons are well known, and those are the serious questions. The reasons are that people, about 10% of the population, voted on what they call agenda, policy, programs, and ideas, what an election would be about in a free country. 10%. The rest voted on imagery. The elections are run by the same guys who sell you toothpaste and cars. Their job, they don't tell you when they sell a car, here are the properties of the car. I mean, if you did that, you wouldn't need advertising. That would be a market system, but we don't believe in market systems where you provide information to people. We believe in systems that are based on deceit. You have to deceive the public into carrying out what's called consumer choice by putting a sexy model in the car or having it drive up a sheer cliff or something like that. And it's the same with, that's the whole system. That's the whole system is based on deceit. And that's the opposite of a market system, I should say. And it's the same is true in the political arena. It's based on deceit. And furthermore, it's not concealed. So, take a look at yesterday's New York Times and the op-ed pages. They have two op-eds about how the Democrats could, overcome their problems. And both op-eds are, one by a professor at NYU, another one at Berkeley, are about ways to deceive the public into sneaking in your own policies by lying to them. Well, that makes perfect sense in a society that's based on deceiving the public, whether it's to undermine markets or whether it's to undermine democracy. And in fact, that's what happened. People voted for images. Bush is trained to project the image of someone who will defend you from terror and has moral values. And Kerry is trained to project the image of somebody who cares about the economy and health. And in fact, if you look at the voting voters, they tended to believe that the candidate they voted for had their opinion, which is totally false when you look at the actual opinions and the positions of the candidates. But you vote for the image, just like you buy a Chevrolet because of the sexy model or something. You vote for the image, and the actual attitudes of the population, I gave a sample of them before, from studies that appeared right before the election from the major institutions. They're just off the agenda totally. Just think of the things that I mentioned. It goes on like that. They don't even appear. So people are voting for images, and the Bush image got a little more than the Kerry image. But what it amounts to is flipping a coin for king. And if it turns out, to get back to the flaws, to the electoral vote, suppose it turns out that the coin was a little bit biased. Okay, maybe it was. That doesn't change anything. Okay, so they flipped the biased coin for the king. That's not the problem. The problem is a quite different one, and it's the different one that we ought to be concerned about.